I woke up in a hospital bed not knowing my own last name for the first 3 minutes. And by the time my memory came back, my best friend of 15 years had already signed away my half of the company we built together. That's not an exaggeration for effect. That's the actual timeline, verified later by document timestamps that I've stared at more times than I'd like to admit. My name is Josh, and this is the story of how I lost my business, my best friend, and almost my life, all within the same 11 days, and how I only found out about 2 of those 3 losses after I woke up. I need to start before the coma, because none of what happened afterward makes sense without understanding what came before it. 15 years of friendship, 6 years of business partnership, and the particular kind of trust that only exists between 2 people who've built something from absolutely nothing, together, side by side, for long enough that you stop being able to imagine the version of your life where the other person isn't in it. I met Derek in college, in a shared dorm room neither of us had chosen, in the way most unlikely lifelong friendships start: proximity, boredom, and the slow accumulation of inside jokes that eventually calcify into something permanent. We were nothing alike on paper. I was cautious, methodical, the kind of person who read every line of a syllabus before the first day of class. Derek was charismatic, impulsive, the kind of person who could talk his way into concerts we didn't have tickets for and convince professors to give him extensions he absolutely didn't deserve. Somehow, that combination worked. He pushed me toward risks I would have avoided on my own. I kept him from the kind of reckless decisions that would have derailed him entirely. For 15 years, we balanced each other in a way that felt less like friendship and more like some kind of quiet, permanent architecture holding up both our lives. 6 years ago, we started a company together, a software consulting firm that helped small and mid-sized businesses modernize outdated systems. Unglamorous work that turned out to be surprisingly lucrative once we built a reputation for actually delivering on time, which apparently put us ahead of roughly 90% of our competition. We named it Ashgrove Technical Partners, after the street where Derek's childhood home used to sit before it was torn down for a strip mall, a small sentimental detail that used to make me smile every time I saw our logo. We split ownership 50-50, formalized through an operating agreement drafted by a lawyer we'd found through a mutual friend, a document neither of us read as carefully as we probably should have, because at the time, 6 years ago, reading it carefully felt almost insulting to the friendship, like we were preparing for a betrayal neither of us could imagine happening between us. The company grew steadily. By year 4, we had 11 employees, a small office space we'd genuinely been proud to walk into every morning, and revenue that had finally started paying us both real salaries instead of the barely livable amounts we'd survived on during the early years. I handled operations and client relationships, the detail-oriented work I'd always been suited for. Derek handled sales and business development, using the same charisma that had once talked us into concerts to now talk mid-sized manufacturing companies into 6-figure modernization contracts. We were, by almost every external measure, a genuine success story, the kind of partnership people used as an example when they talked about how founding a business with a close friend could actually work, contrary to all the cautionary advice about never mixing friendship and money. I want to be honest that there were small cracks before the coma, cracks I noticed but didn't examine closely enough, because examining them would have meant confronting something about Derek I wasn't ready to confront yet. About 8 months before everything happened, Derek started making decisions without consulting me the way he used to, signing off on vendor contracts, adjusting employee compensation, making commitments to clients during sales calls that I'd only find out about after the fact. When operational reality collided with whatever promise he'd made to close the deal, when I brought it up, he'd wave it off with the same charm that had always smoothed over his impulsiveness in college. You worry about the details, I worry about growth. That's always been our thing, right? And because it had always sort of been our thing, I let it go more times than I should have. There was also, in retrospect, a growing tension around money. Not company money exactly, but Derek's personal finances, which I only had partial visibility into but which seemed, from small comments he'd make, increasingly strained despite his salary being nearly identical to mine. An expensive divorce 2 years earlier had clearly hit him harder than he ever fully admitted. A boat he'd bought impulsively and rarely used sat in a marina, quietly bleeding money every month. I noticed these things. I mentioned them exactly once, carefully, over drinks, and Derek's response was sharp enough. I don't tell you how to spend your money, Josh, that I never brought it up again. I share all of this not to excuse what happened next, but because I think it matters that there were warning signs I chose not to fully examine. The same way most people, looking back at any betrayal, can usually find a trail of small moments that, taken individually, seemed forgivable, but that, taken together, painted a much clearer picture than I let myself see at the time. 11 months ago, I was driving home from a client meeting on a rain-slicked highway when a truck merging without signaling clipped the front corner of my car, sending me into a guardrail at a speed that, according to the police report I read months later, should have killed me outright. I don't remember the accident itself. I don't remember the ambulance, or the first several days in the ICU, or most of what happened during the 11 days I spent in a medically induced coma while my brain and body fought to recover from a traumatic injury that the neurologists, when I finally woke up, described with the particular careful optimism doctors use when they're relieved but not yet certain the relief is warranted. I woke up on a Tuesday, according to my wife Elena, though it took me nearly 3 full minutes of blinking at fluorescent lights and a stranger's face. A nurse, though I couldn't process that fact yet, before I could remember my own name. Elena told me later that those 3 minutes were the most frightening of her entire life. Watching me stare at her with complete blankness before something finally clicked back into place behind my eyes and I said her name, quiet and confused, like I was testing whether it was still true. The next several days were consumed entirely by recovery, physical therapy, cognitive assessments, careful monitoring for the kind of complications that can follow a traumatic brain injury even after the initial danger has passed. I wasn't thinking about the company. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to what happened next. During those first days of consciousness, Ashgrove Technical Partners simply didn't exist in my mind. I was relearning how to hold a fork steadily. I was straining to remember the names of my own nieces and nephews during a cognitive test that felt, at the time, like the most important exam of my life. The business was the furthest thing from my thoughts. Derek visited twice during that first week. Both visits were brief, oddly formal, nothing like the easy, joking presence he'd been at my hospital bedside during smaller emergencies over the years. A broken arm from a college ski trip, an appendectomy 4 years into our friendship. He seemed distracted, checking his phone more than felt normal, even for someone visiting a friend recovering from a traumatic injury. At the time, I attributed it to stress, to the awkwardness some people feel around hospitals, to the general disorientation of watching a close friend relearn basic cognitive tasks. I didn't think anything more of it. I had no capacity, in that state, to think anything more of it. I was discharged after 19 days total, moved into a home recovery period that my doctors estimated would take another 2 to 3 months before I could realistically return to work in any capacity. Elena had been fielding calls from the company during my hospitalization, relaying basic updates, careful not to burden me with anything that might complicate my recovery. She told me, during my second week home, that Derek had mentioned needing to make some temporary operational adjustments to keep the business running smoothly while I was out, and that this had sounded reasonable enough at the time that she hadn't pushed for more detail, focused entirely, as she should have been, on whether I was going to fully recover. It was 5 weeks after I woke up, during a follow-up appointment with my cognitive therapist where we discussed my readiness to gradually reintroduce work-related tasks, that I first opened my company email again, intending to simply catch up on messages at a slow, manageable pace. I found an email from Derek, sent to all 11 employees, dated the 9th day of my coma, 2 days before I regained consciousness, while I was still unconscious in an ICU bed with machines breathing for parts of my recovery that my own body couldn't yet manage. The subject line read, "Leadership Transition and Path Forward." I read that email standing in my kitchen, coffee going cold in my hand, my heart rate climbing in a way my cognitive therapist had specifically warned could trigger complications during early recovery. The email announced, in Derek's familiar, confident tone, that due to unforeseen circumstances affecting company leadership, he would be assuming full operational control of Ashgrove Technical Partners effective immediately, and that he was optimistic about the company's continued growth under this restructured leadership model. Restructured leadership model. I read that phrase probably a dozen times before its actual meaning fully landed. My best friend had sent an email to our entire company, while I was in a coma with no ability to consent to or even be aware of what was happening, announcing that he was taking over. I called our company lawyer that same afternoon, my hands shaking badly enough that Elena had to help me hold the phone steady. What I learned over the following days, piece by piece, through documents I requested and a growing, sick understanding of exactly what had happened, was worse than the email alone had suggested. Our original operating agreement, the one we'd signed 6 years earlier without reading as carefully as we should have, contained a clause, one I genuinely didn't remember agreeing to, though my signature was undeniably on the document, granting either partner the ability to assume temporary sole operational authority in the event the other partner becomes incapacitated and unable to fulfill their duties for the continued operational stability of the business. It was meant, Our lawyer explained when I finally understood the full document. As a reasonable safeguard, the kind of clause that exists in countless partnership agreements to prevent a business from grinding to a halt if one partner suddenly can't function. A medical emergency, an extended absence. Exactly the kind of situation I'd unknowingly found myself in. The clause wasn't inherently the problem. Temporary operational authority during a medical crisis is a normal, defensible business protection. The problem was what Derek had done with it. During the 11 days I was unconscious, and the following weeks while I remained hospitalized, and then in early home recovery, Derek had used that temporary authority to make a series of decisions that went far beyond keeping the business operationally stable. He had renegotiated his own compensation, tripling his salary under the justification of expanded leadership responsibilities during the transition period. He had initiated a new equity structure, one that diluted my ownership stake from 50% to 22%, justified in the paperwork as compensation for leadership continuity services rendered during partner incapacitation, a phrase that, when I finally read it in full, made me feel physically sick in a way that had nothing to do with my recovering brain. Worst of all, he had begun negotiations to sell a majority stake of the company to an outside investment group, negotiations that, according to timestamps on the documents, had begun on day 6 of my coma, while I was still unconscious with no ability to know, let alone consent to, any part of what was happening to the company I had spent 6 years building alongside him. I want to try to describe what it felt like, discovering all of this while still recovering from a traumatic brain injury, still relearning to trust my own memory and judgment after weeks of genuine cognitive uncertainty. There's a particular kind of vertigo that comes from realizing the person you trusted most, outside of your own spouse, had made a calculated decision, while your body was fighting simply to survive, to take advantage of a legal loophole meant to protect the business, and use it instead to protect himself, at my direct expense, during the exact period I was most powerless to stop him. I confronted Derek 2 weeks after discovering the email. In a meeting, our lawyers insisted on formalizing rather than letting happen spontaneously, given what was clearly about to become a significant legal dispute. Before that meeting, though, there was another moment I haven't mentioned yet, one that I think matters more than almost anything else in this story. 3 days after I first read that leadership transition email, before I'd even hired a lawyer, before I fully understood the scope of what had happened, I called Derek directly. Not through attorneys. Just Josh calling Derek, the way I'd called him 1,000 times before over 15 years, hoping, I think, for some explanation that would make this all make sense, some version of events where my best friend hadn't actually done what the documents suggested he'd done. He answered on the first ring, which I remember finding strange even in the moment, like he'd been waiting for that call, rehearsing for it. Josh, hey, how are you feeling? I've been meaning to check in properly. I read the email, Derek. The one you sent while I was still in the coma. There was a pause, brief but noticeable. Okay, I figured you'd have questions about the transition stuff eventually. Look, it's not as dramatic as it probably looks on paper. I was just trying to keep things from falling apart while you were out. You tripled your salary, Derek. You changed the ownership split. You started talking to investors about selling the company. While I was unconscious, I was managing a crisis alone, Josh. Nobody was there to help me make those calls. I did what felt necessary at the time, and honestly, I think if the situation were reversed, I'd want you to have the flexibility to act too. I remember standing in my kitchen during that call, staring at the same email still open on my laptop screen, feeling something in my chest crack open in a way that had nothing to do with my recovering brain and everything to do with finally, fully understanding that the person on the other end of the line had made a choice, clear-eyed and deliberate, to treat my medical emergency as an opportunity rather than a crisis to protect me through. That phone call ended with both of us agreeing, tensely, that we needed to figure this out properly, which turned out to mean lawyers, which turned out to mean the formal meeting 2 weeks later. I remember sitting across from him in a conference room neither of us had chosen, both of our lawyers present, and searching his face for something, guilt, discomfort, anything that resembled the friend I'd known for 15 years, and finding instead a kind of practiced, business-like calm that frightened me more than anger would have. I want you to understand, Derek said, before I'd even finished asking my first question, that everything I did was within the legal authority granted by our agreement. I'm not going to apologize for keeping the company stable during a crisis you weren't in a position to manage. You tripled your own salary while I was unconscious, Derek. You diluted my ownership by more than half. You started negotiating to sell the company without me. Explain to me how any of that was about stability. The compensation adjustment reflected the actual increased workload I was carrying, solo, running a company built for 2 people. The equity restructuring compensated me fairly for that burden. And the investor conversations were preliminary, exploratory. Nothing was finalized, and frankly, given how uncertain your recovery timeline looked at the time, exploring options felt responsible, not malicious. My recovery timeline was uncertain because I was in a coma, Derek. You were making permanent decisions about my life's work based on a situation you had no way of knowing the outcome of. He was quiet for a moment, and for just a second, something flickered across his face that looked almost like the friend I remembered. Then it was gone, replaced by the same careful, lawyered calm. I did what I thought was necessary. I'm sorry you're upset about it, but I'm not going to pretend I regret protecting the company during a moment when, frankly, nobody could tell me for certain you were coming back. That sentence, nobody could tell me for certain you were coming back, has stayed with me every day since, in a way that I think will probably never fully leave. I understand, intellectually, that 11 days in a coma is genuinely terrifying for the people around you. That uncertainty about whether a loved one will recover is its own kind of trauma, and that Derek, in some distorted way, might have told himself a story where his actions were justified by that uncertainty. But there's a difference between a friend acting protectively during a crisis and a friend using that crisis as cover to seize control, triple his own compensation, and quietly begin selling off the thing you'd both spent 6 years building. And somewhere in those 11 days, Derek had crossed from the first kind of person into the second, and I don't think he's ever fully admitted that to himself, even now. The legal battle that followed took 9 months. 9 months of depositions, forensic accounting reviews of the company's finances during my incapacitation, and a slow, exhausting effort to prove that Derek's actions had exceeded the reasonable scope of the emergency authority clause, rather than simply exercising legitimate business judgment during a genuine crisis, which is exactly the argument his lawyers built the entire defense around. I want to be honest that during those 9 months, I sometimes doubted myself in ways that surprised me. Derek's lawyers were skilled, and there were moments during depositions when their version of events, a loyal partner forced into difficult decisions during genuine uncertainty about his best friend's survival, sounded almost plausible, even to me. Even though I'd lived the reality of what had actually happened to my ownership stake and my salary and my company's future while I lay unconscious in a hospital bed with no say in any of it. One deposition in particular still sits heavily with me. Elena was called to testify about the timeline of communications during my hospitalization, and I watched her, from across the room, describe in careful, precise detail the specific dates Derek had reached out to her. Always brief, always slightly evasive about details, always framed in language designed to sound reassuring without actually being informative. She described one call, on what turned out to be day 7 of my coma, where Derek had asked her, almost casually, whether she'd given any thought to how the company might need to evolve if my recovery took longer than expected or if it didn't go the way everyone was hoping. Elena told the room, her voice steady despite what I could tell was genuine anger beneath it, that she had been too frightened and exhausted at the time to fully register what that question was really asking. It was only months later, reviewing the timeline alongside our lawyer, that she realized Derek had been testing the waters for exactly the kind of takeover he executed 2 days later, probing my own wife, while I lay unconscious, for how much resistance he might face if he moved forward with a plan that assumed I might never wake up at all. Hearing that testimony, sitting in that deposition room, was one of the hardest moments of the entire 9 months, harder, in some ways, than reading the original email had been, because it made clear that Derek's actions hadn't been some impulsive decision made in a single moment of panic. They had been considered, tested, and deliberately timed. What ultimately broke the case in my favor wasn't any single dramatic piece of evidence, but an accumulation of small, damning details that painted a much clearer picture than Derek's careful framing allowed for. Email timestamps showing investor outreach had begun while I was still listed as being in critical, unstable condition, well before any reasonable person could claim confidence I wouldn't recover. Internal messages between Derek and our accountant, discovered during forensic review, discussing how to structure the equity dilution before Josh is well enough to push back. A phrase that, once it surfaced, effectively ended any pretense that his actions had been motivated purely by operational necessity rather than personal opportunity. The settlement, reached just before the case would have gone to trial, restored my original 50% ownership stake, reversed the compensation changes Derek had made during my incapacitation, and included a substantial payment to cover both my legal costs and damages tied to the diminished value my stake had briefly held on paper during the dispute. It also, functionally, ended our partnership. As part of the settlement, Derek agreed to sell his remaining stake to me over an 18-month buyout period, at a valuation determined by independent appraisal, removing him entirely from the company we'd built together. I now own Ashgrove Technical Partners outright. I kept the name, even though every time I see our logo, the one named after Derek's childhood street, I feel a complicated mixture of pride in what we built and a grief I don't think will ever fully resolve for the version of that friendship I thought was permanent enough to survive anything. Derek and I haven't spoken since the settlement was finalized. I've heard, through mutual friends who still occasionally update me whether I ask for it or not, that he started a new consulting venture about 6 months ago, smaller, still finding its footing. I don't wish him failure, exactly, though I won't pretend I feel nothing when I hear updates about his life. Mostly what I feel, if I'm honest, is a kind of quiet disbelief that 15 years of genuine friendship, real friendship, the kind built on actual shared history rather than convenience, turned out to have a breaking point I never anticipated, one that arrived not through some slow erosion of trust, but through 11 days when I simply wasn't conscious enough to protect myself. And he decided, in that window, that protecting himself mattered more than protecting me. I think about that email often, leadership transition and path forward, sent to 11 employees who trusted both of us, while I lay in a hospital bed with machines managing functions my own body couldn't yet handle. I think about the specific choice involved in sending that email on day 9 rather than waiting even a few more days to see whether I'd wake up, whether I'd recover, whether there might still be a version of this crisis that didn't require him to act as though I was already gone. I've since added far more careful language to Ashgrove's operating agreement. Narrow, specific limitations on what temporary operational authority actually permits during a partner's incapacitation, developed with a different lawyer, one who insisted, this time, that I read every single line before signing, no matter how insulting it felt to imagine needing that protection against people I trusted. I've also, slowly, started rebuilding a version of trust in new business relationships, though it's a more careful, deliberate kind of trust now, the kind that assumes good faith but protects against its absence anyway, rather than the reflexive, unguarded trust one extended to Derek for 15 years without ever imagining I might need protection from the person I trusted most. My recovery from the accident itself took almost a full year before my doctors considered me fully healed, cognitively and physically. In some ways, that recovery was simpler than the other one, the slower, less measurable process of accepting that the 11 days I lost to unconsciousness cost me something beyond just time. They cost me a friendship I'd built my adult life around, taken from me not by the accident itself, but by a decision someone made while I couldn't stop them, someone who I'd spent 15 years believing would never need to be stopped. Elena and I talk sometimes about the strange, specific cruelty of the timing, that if the truck had merged into me 30 seconds earlier or later, if the coma had lasted 9 days instead of 11, if Derek had waited even a week longer before sending that email, we might still have our old life, our old friendship, our old, uncomplicated trust in the people closest to us. But I've come to believe that timing wasn't really the variable that mattered. Derek didn't become a different person during those 11 days. He simply found himself, for the first time in 15 years of friendship, in a situation where taking advantage of me was actually possible, where the usual checks of an ongoing relationship, the daily conversations, the shared decision-making, the simple fact of my being conscious and present, were temporarily removed. What happened during that window wasn't a sudden betrayal, so much as a revelation of something that had probably always been possible in him, just never before given the specific, narrow opportunity to surface. I still keep a framed photo in my office from the early years of the company. Derek and me standing in front of Ashgrove's very first, tiny rented office space. Both of us grinning, exhausted, proud of something we'd built with almost nothing but stubbornness and each other's belief in the plan. I've thought about taking it down more than once. I haven't yet. Some part of me still wants to remember that the friendship was real for 14 of those 15 years, even if the 15th year revealed something about its limits I wish I'd never had to learn. If you've ever trusted someone completely, only to discover the exact moment you were most vulnerable was the moment they chose to take advantage of that trust, I want to hear about it. I used to believe real friendship meant a person's true character during a crisis. I still believe that. I just learned, far more painfully than I ever expected to, that sometimes the crisis itself is the test, and not everyone you love passes it.